Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you from 5 prestigious universities. I'm particularly delighted to stand here to open the conference I moderated 6 years ago. I'm glad to see the familiar faces, and I extend my warmest greetings to the graduate students from the 5 universities. In 2018, Che Institute for Advanced Studies succeeded to co-host the 5 university conference instead of Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies. The Che Institute, named after the SK Group's founding father, Che Jong-hyun, was established to commemorate the 20th anniversary of his passing away. The Che Institute has 3 main pillars of missions. First, identifying geopolitical risk. Second, examining the opportunities and challenges posed by cutting-edge scientific innovation. And third, exploring the impact of scientific innovation on geopolitical risk. Since its launch, the Che Institute has been a driving force for knowledge sharing and academic collaboration with the world-leading counterparts around the world. This morning, we are expected to talk on new regional order in East Asia and the Korean Peninsula. When it's come to the new security landscape in East Asia, I'd like to highlight the recent unprecedented rapprochement between Korea and Japan, and the historic Camp David Trilateral Summit last August. During the 3rd Trans-Pacific Dialogue hosted by Che Institute last week in Washington, D.C., some participants even suggested forming a NATO-like Indo-Pacific alliance. At the same time, as Professor Lee Dong-sun pointed out yesterday, the coalition of the revisionist powers are intensified against the US-led liberal hegemony. Ladies and gentlemen, East Asia is at the forefront of the scientific innovation and cutting-edge technologies. East Asia also became the epicenter of global supply chain in the core fields of semiconductors, EV batteries, biopharmaceutical, and many of the state-of-the-art technologies. Against this backdrop, I hope we can have in-depth discussion on the impact of scientific innovation on geopolitical risk today. As everyone here is well aware, the international community has been faced with unprecedented simultaneous geopolitical headwinds in Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and North Korea. Such numerous international crises have pushed the United States and its allies to a unique predicament. First, the United States can no longer handle these major ongoing or potential conflict by itself alone, especially in case of simultaneous outbreaks. On top of that, scientific innovation has transformed the nature of modern warfare and conflict spectrum. Under such circumstances, there has been a growing concern among Korean public on the hypothetical 2 theater wars simultaneously occurring in the Taiwan Strait and the Korean Peninsula. When it's come to the North Korean conundrum, I am extremely discouraged by the fact that we have fumbled every opportunity to suffocate North Korea's ever-increasing nuclear ambitions during the last 3 decades. All diplomatic démarches since the early 1990s, ranging from bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral, and even hexalateral, including 6-party talks, have completely failed. Next year will mark the 30th anniversary of 1994 Geneva Agreement. If left unattended, the current failure are going to trigger a new nuclear arms race in East Asia, which will leave serious impact on the region and beyond. This has led to growing frustration and despair on the part of the Korean public. According to the Che Institute Gallup Korea poll result last December, 76% of Koreans expressed support for Korea's indigenous development of nuclear weapons. Former President Trump's potential re-election has added a sense of unpredictability to the future security landscape of East Asia. In 2016 interview with New York Times, Trump said he would be open to allowing Japan and Korea to build their own nuclear arsenals rather than depends on American nuclear umbrella. He also said that he would be willing to withdraw US forces from both Korea and Japan. The Trump trauma persists in the minds of many Koreans and allies. Ladies and gentlemen, lastly, we must also pay our special attention to the rise of populism, which I believe is fueled by the collapse of the middle class since 2008 financial crisis. This erosion, further exacerbated by the pandemic and deepened existing societal divisions. The rapid advance of technological innovation was a final blow that has created a digital divide, widening the gap between the haves and have-nots. When I served as chair of the Second Committee of the UN General Assembly in 2008, which dealt with then the global financial crisis, our committee made a historic conclusion that the vulnerable are hit the hardest. That actually, financial crisis hit the least developed countries the hardest. The lower class in any country was also hit the hardest. Such damage led to the collapse or a serious contraction of the middle class, which invited new kinds of populism around the world. I have briefly outlined some of the major challenges of the region that entail in-depth discussions. As is always the case, it's easy to raise a question, but difficult to answer. But given the special situation of East Asia and the Korean Peninsula at the moment, I have to count on your great collective wisdom. I look forward to exciting and lively discussion today. I thank you.
We had a wonderful welcoming address by President Park. And we will start the keynote presentations. And as we are always proud of, another nickname of 5 University Conference is the Avengers Reunion. And we have 5 Avengers from 5 University addressing the issue of Northeast Asian security and the Korean Peninsula. Without further ado, let me invite Professor Sung-Han Kim of Korea University for the first keynote presentation. I ask each keynote presenter for about 10 minute, 8 to 10 minute keynote presentation. And then we will have a first round of discussion among the panelists, and then I will open the floor for the Q&As. Okay, Professor Kim, please.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank President Park In-guk of the Che Institute for giving me this great opportunity to speak to distinguished experts in the hall. Today, I will be talking about ROK's challenges and opportunities in the middle of US-China strategic competition. As we may agree, it is difficult to define the East Asian order in a couple of words. It is even more difficult to choose one among the following scenarios, such as US-led regional order or China-led regional order, or U.S.-China strategic rivalry, or U.S.-China condominium, or East Asian concert of power as the future of the regional order. While the United States maintains its stronger leadership in the region, China will continue to make multi-layered efforts to weaken the U.S. leadership. United States will be maintaining its strategic advantage over China in the region for a considerable period of time based on its dynamic economy, overwhelming military power, and a solid alliance system in the region. Nevertheless, U.S.-China strategic competition will continue to be intensified. Against this backdrop, I believe that the U.S.-China strategic competition presents Korea with three challenges and three opportunities. First challenge is that U.S.-China strategic competition makes the North Korean nuclear issue more difficult to deal with. During the fire and fury of 2017, China joined resolutions against North Korea at the UN Security Council. Even before that, China was the country who supported 5 UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea that North Korea's Kim Jong-un requested Trump to be lifted at the Hanoi summit in 2019. But now China, along with Russia, is refusing to adopt even the chairman's statement, let alone the UN Security Council resolutions. It has become harder to put pressure on North Korea. This means ROK and the United States should find ways to persuade China to delink the North Korean nuclear issue from the U.S.-China strategic competition. The second challenge for ROK is that U.S.-China strategic competition is doubling the burden of alliance management on the United States. The failure to properly manage alliances could result in serious consequences for the United States. The reason that America's allies have maintained an alliance with the United States, despite deep and wide economic cooperation with China, is because the United States is the only country now who can play a leadership role to maintain the liberal international order, and China is yet to become an alternative for the United States. However, if the United States only calls for quote-unquote America first and breaks the principles of liberal international order on its own, the problem will become even more serious. If a neo-isolationist or mercantilist candidate becomes the next president of the United States, America's allies will be greatly shaken, and South Korea will be no exception. If that happens, the United States will have to worry about the so-called alliance transition from the United States to China. In other words, the United States could see a strategic shift in which its allies put more emphasis or value on their cooperation with China rather than on their alliance relationship with the United States. It is often said that alliance transition precedes power transition from the hegemon to the challenger. Therefore, ROK and the United States have to keep in mind that their alliance is entering a very important period over the next year until US presidential elections in November. The third challenge is that growing US-China competition will be working against Korean unification. ROK is likely to face an obstacle for unification when US and China intensify their competition on the Korean Peninsula as well as in East Asia. China appears to be looking at North Korea through the lens of its relationship with the United States, which means China could link the North Korean issue to Taiwan and South China Sea issues with a view to drawing strategic concessions from the United States. Besides those challenges, US-China strategic competition has provided ROK with three opportunities. First, ROK found some space to improve its relations with Japan, through which it could strengthen ROK-US-Japan trilateral security cooperation. China's lack of cooperation with the US on the North Korean nuclear missile issue has given ROK no other choice but to strengthen ROK-US-Japan trilateral cooperation against North Korea. That is why President Yoon moved quickly to improve Korea-Japan relations, which has contributed to the success of the Camp David Summit, strengthening the trilateral security cooperation. Second opportunity is that ROK is expanding its diplomatic horizon in the region, which is growing in geopolitical and geoeconomic importance due to US-China strategic rivalry. Yoon Suk-yeol government announced the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report in December last year. The Indo-Pacific Strategy, I would say, is a comprehensive regional strategy that aims to promote its national interests and contribute to peace and prosperity in the Pacific region. Third opportunity is that Korea can play a constructive role in Southeast Asia, which is the overlapped area of US Indo-Pacific Strategy and China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. Therefore, ASEAN countries are concerned that Southeast Asia has become a kind of a battleground for great power politics. By the way, ROK is a unique example of a transformation from an aid recipient country to a donor country, and it is not being seen as a member of great power politics by ASEAN member states. Therefore, if South Korea plays a unique role model by increasing communications on development and even security cooperation with ASEAN member states, it can produce a meaningful outcome to dilute a great power rivalry. Korea and the United States have also recently agreed to strengthen discussions on development cooperation through several summit meetings. Since the ROK US-Japan Phnom Penh Summit and Camp David Summit decided to expand development cooperation to a trilateral level, there is a need to flesh out a concrete plan for trilateral cooperation on ASEAN. This, I would say, must be an opportunity for the Republic of Korea. On that positive note, let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. Well, based on your academic experience and also the policy experience, you have pointed out clear three challenges and three opportunities. Next, I will invite Professor John Ikenberry from Princeton.
Thank you, Jason. It's great to be here. I'm going to speak from the chair. I'm nursing a bad back, so it just is better for me. Thank you for that. And thank you, Ambassador Park. It's great to be here, and the Che Institute has been so generous over the years in its support for these kind of gatherings. And these gatherings are, as we've suggested, are increasingly important by the swirl of events in the region and more generally around the world. So let me just make some general comments about, as I've been asked to do, focusing on US-China competition and its implications for regional order. And start at the most general level, a theme that we've been developing over the course of the, over the course of the last day, the breakdown, the fragmentation of world politics. The world is increasingly divided. The Ukraine war has been certainly a reflection of that. It's illuminated it, but it's also in some ways, catalyzed further division. We might have thought otherwise, that the Ukraine war would unite the world. Here we have a UN event, military forces crossing internationally recognized borders to take territory from a sovereign country. What can be more core to the stable world order that we want to live in than that? And yet the world did not unite. It divided, it moved in its corners. And increasingly, as I would argue, we see a kind of a semi-durable grouping of states that I would say are increasingly divided by their agendas for world order. We might call them the Global West, which is this liberal democratic coalition with long roots and a well-established playbook for how you build cooperation, how you solve problems, how you mobilize resources for all sorts of global issues tied to solidarity among liberal democracies. A global East, which is increasingly taking shape. The war in Ukraine has brought China and Russia together in new ways, and the other states around them that form this other coalition. And the global South, which is increasingly important as a voice, if not a power center, for how we think about international politics. And it's interesting that these three worlds are each possessed of different narratives about how we got to the point we're at, different visions of international order, different grievances and hopes about the future, and different agendas for policy action. And they're forming at a point where the world itself is increasingly unstable. The study of instability is the hottest topic in international relations. Some people talk about a polycrisis, crisis that cuts across issues of the environment, pandemics, and of course great power politics and the crisis of democracy, all folded into one. My second point is that US-China relations are deteriorating in that context. And indeed, they are the center of this world development that I've been describing. Increasingly, these two superpowers, if we can call them that, are systemic rivals. They see each other as the primary rival, if not threat, in the global system. The other stands in the way of many of the aspirations that each has. This rivalry is deeply rooted in power, in geography, in legacy, commitments and investments and equities in world politics, and by ideas. Ideas matter, values matter. Multilateralism is not value neutral. The world order has implications. It tilts the playing field in different directions depending on what those institutions are. And it's a comprehensive rivalry in that it cuts across economics and politics and security and technology. As Ambassador Park was saying, that's in some ways the battlefield for the 21st century. And I'll say more about that in a minute. The Global South looks at this superpower rivalry and doesn't want to take sides. It's, in some sense, it's bad news for the Global South, but it's also good news in an interesting way because it allows them to pick and choose alliances, to be ad hoc in their affiliations, looking to trade, to China for trade and for security from the United States, to the eagle for markets, eagle for security and the dragon for markets, if you will. And this is an important observation when it comes to Korea and the peninsula, in that Korea, as Sun Han has said, is uniquely positioned as a country that really sits astride east and west and north and south. It is the first country that was a recipient of ODA to now be a patron of ODA. It can see the world from both sides and in both directions. And so it has a kind of interpretive role, a role as an intermediary, building bridges and illuminating problems. My third point, the U.S. and its partners, which include, very importantly, South Korea, are engaged in what I would call a very creative moment. We will look back at this moment and say, wow, it was a crazy time, But interesting, new, novel things were done. New relationships were built, new ways of thinking about world politics emerged. We think of alliances and partnerships, often the term is used gardening. You always need to keep them up. Partnerships, alliances don't simply get started and exist in perpetuity because they were created. You have to work to keep them going. Gardening, George Shultz, the American Secretary of State, used that term. I think it goes back to Dean Acheson, who used that same metaphor. But this isn't gardening, this is planting new seeds, I think. The Quad, there's something, it's not East Asian, but the Atlantic Group. Most of you probably don't even know about it, but trying to connect North and South Atlantic countries. The important historic move between Japan and Korea and the United States as a third party, the Camp David Accord, the CHIPS Group, and the G7, which has a new life, and which at Hiroshima, the last meeting hosted by Japan, Japan called it the most important international conference that Japan has held. And who did they invite? They invited President Yoon, they invited Modi, they invited Lula. It was an attempt to use that platform for bringing countries in. And the proposal I would make today is that, and others have done it, that Korea should be made a member of the G7, make it the G8. Australia would make it 9. Do I hear any more bidding? There's lots of different opportunities, but Korea, it has to be first and foremost. It's there informally already. But we know where the world is going in that way. Fourthly, there seems to be some evolution in U.S.-China relations. Yes, it's conflicted. Yes, it's a rivalrous relationship. Yes, it's deeply rooted, so it's not going to go away. It will be with us for the rest of our lives in one way or another. But there seems to be some effort at managing conflict, or at least I think the Biden administration is trying to figure out whether there's appetite in Beijing for putting what you might call a foundation underneath this rivalry. Neither wants to give up. The stakes are high, but they want to, in my reading, increasingly try to, in this crazy time, unstable time, provide some guardrails, some foundation. Look at the recent Biden-Xi meeting. What did the U.S. want going into that meeting most of all? Low expectations for sure, but reestablish mill-to-mill. That's a good example of crisis risk management, if you will. Clarifying red lines, identifying rules of the road, keeping the channels open for communication. And in this way, keeping the conversation open for issues of Northeast Asia. In the period ahead when proliferation, Korean acquisition of nuclear weapons, we're going to talk more about that today, is something we don't want necessarily to happen. If it's not going to happen, China and the United States are going to have to be on the same side looking for ways to restrain North Korea. We've tried it for a generation of policymakers. They're exhausted. I've heard them talk recently in Washington. They give up. They don't know what to do with North Korea. But there is going to have to be fresh leadership on that issue, and it's going to have to come through Washington, Beijing, and Seoul. So this is an important new step. The other reason why I think there's some evolution in U.S.-China relations is that I think there's some strategic updating going on in both capitals. China, I think, does sense new vulnerabilities. Its era of double-digit growth is over with. Demography, slow growth, domestic economic problems, unemployment, the famous Xi narrative of inevitability seems to be no longer very persuasive. The narrative of inevitability, that China would become the world leader inevitably and pass the United States inevitably in decline. There doesn't seem to be that power transition, dramatic trajectory that many people were basing their strategic calculations on. It looks more like a muddle. On the United States side, it's a mixed picture. On the one hand, there is a kind of new demonstration of capacity for cooperation across the democratic world triggered by Ukraine. The proof positive that you can leverage power multilaterally to put pressure on a great power, not to solve the problem, but you see new capacities that you didn't think were there that might have been atrophied. But the U.S. is also worrying about overstretch, and can it do what it's doing in Europe and the Middle East and also be a key player in this pivot to East Asia? We've talked about that yesterday. And of course, Trump lurks in the background. So my bottom line, to summarize, is the 3 points. Number one, both China and the United States need partners, and so there is leverage for countries like South Korea. There's agency that middle powers have that they didn't have in an earlier period. There is pressure on Beijing and the United States to be responsible great powers. Secondly, the competition between the US and China can't be won. There's not going to be a kind of final kind of triumph on one side or the other. It's going to be a kind of ongoing feature of the system with two global power formations. I would still put my bet on the US-led power formation, but it's not going to be a universal power formation. What this means is that the existential dangers of one power taking over and dominating the world at the expense of the other seems less persuasive than it did even a couple years ago. And so the incentive, I draw the inference that the incentive will be there in Beijing and Washington to increasingly look for the terms for coexistence. Thirdly and finally, Mr. Chairman, I think South Korea, the United States, Japan, as core partners in this trilateral part of Northeast Asia, need to find a language to talk to China about these core issues of starting with nuclear vulnerability and working outwards, and a language to reach out to the global South. It can't be the vernacular of American democracy and liberalism. It needs to be one where countries that don't share the traditions that I'm talking about can nonetheless get the idea that we are on the same side when it comes to building a world that has rule of law, openness, transparency, best practices, norms of reciprocity, and a sense that at the end of the day, we want to live tomorrow in a world that has a greater respect for human decency than exists today. And that is enough motivation to push us forward, I would hope.
Thank you, John. Ranging from from liberal international order to multilateralism, and plus as well as U.S.-China competition. So, well, you showed a real big picture of where the world is heading for, and also thanks for your comments on the South. What kind of global perspective Korea should have in the middle of this grand transformation. Next, I will invite Professor Zhao Jingguo from Peking University.
Well, thank you, Jason, for your hospitality, and I also want to take this opportunity to thank President Park for his continuous generous support to this kind of events, and for our past cooperation on different functions. When my friend Kim Sung-han summarized the international situation, I heard one narrative, that is the U.S., China is trying to undermine the positions of the U.S. in the region, and the U.S. thought it had to fight back by strengthening military alliances and taking other actions. The Chinese narrative is quite different. The Chinese narrative is, as China rises, the U.S. gets frustrated and begins to adopt various measures to contain China, to undermine China's growth prospect. And China has to fight back. This is the Chinese narrative, very different. Which narrative is more accurate? Depends on your perspective. I think probably a blending of, of the two. Somewhere in between lies the reality. Yeah, I'm going to focus on the new regional international order. Some people say that we are having a new international, new regional order. At least it is emerging, if we are not there, quite there yet. Okay, you can see a lot of signs. One is strengthening of the U.S.-centered military alliances in the region. U.S.-Japan, U.S.-South Korea. And also, now with the rapprochement between Japan and South Korea, and then we may see a trilateral security partnership in the region between South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. And of course, you have the Quad, you have other, trans-regional kind of military arrangements and intelligence arrangements. And also, there is increasing pressures for proliferation of nuclear weapons. Okay, as President Park mentioned, Washington was talking. People were talking about whether how to deploy or redeploy tactic nuclear weapons in the region. And of course, according to a poll not long ago in South Korea, more than 70% of the people polled wanted to have their own nuclear weapons. Okay. And judging from the previous developments, it appears that a new regional order is emerging in the region. Okay. More ideological, okay, as some put it. We see a increasing divide between the so-called authoritarian governments and democratic governments. And second, we see a security realignment in the region. Okay, we see increasing international division between U.S., Japan, ROK on the one hand, and China, Russia, and North Korea on the other. Okay, and also thirdly, you see economically and technologically decouple along ideological and security lines. In other words, both sides feel that for security reasons, they have to take actions to ensure, autonomous, some degree of autonomy to make sure that they, to eliminate the risk of being blackmailed by the other side. Okay. However, it still remains to be seen whether such kind of a new order will ever realize or materialize in the region. Okay. Personally, I still have a lot of doubt about it. Okay. China has maintained a certain distance from Russia so far, okay. Especially on the Russia-Ukraine war. Okay. China has never endorsed Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Not that I know of until this day. Okay. And China has not supplied weapons to Russia. Okay. Second, China has adhered to the policy of its policy on Korean nuclear issue. Okay. It has opposed to nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, opposed to the use of force to resolve the problem, and also and support dialogue and consultation as the appropriate way of managing the Korean a nuclear problem. Okay. Whether that's going to be very efficient or not, but that's China's policy. So China has not endorsed so far, and actually has been opposing North Korea's efforts to acquire or maintain or develop nuclear weapons. And China and Japan and South Korea and the US have maintained close economic ties so far, despite all the chorus about decoupling or connecting or delinking or de-risking more recently. Okay. And there is no consensus, even in the US, on economic and technological decoupling with China, because it is not in the US interest to do so. Okay. It's not just against China's interests, but also against the US interests. Even on the technological front, okay, the US high-tech companies, if they delink with China or decouple from China, then they would lose a huge market. Okay? And they would lose the profits necessary to recuperate their previous investment, and also to invest for the next generation of high tech to stay ahead. So it's not in their interest to do so. And China, Japan, and South Korea are working together in regional multilateral mechanisms such as RCEP and trilateral dialogue between China, Japan, and South Korea. So we are going to have a summit in which our leaders are going to talk about various ways of cooperation. So the reality is far from this new regional order people imagine. Okay, of course, maybe we're moving in that direction, but it is more ideological in a way, but it is uncertain in terms of security realignment. I don't think. Well, on the one hand, you see closer military alliances between the U.S. and its allies in the region, but on the other side, I don't see formation of military alliances so far. Okay, and also there is a lot of uncertainty with regard to economic and technological decoupling. Chances are they are not going to decouple. Okay, they may take measures to de-risk to some extent, but to decouple, that's a big decision. That requires bigger decision. What about the future? I think the main factors shaping the previous developments include, first, the change of balance of power. Okay? China rises, U.S. feels, some Americans feel very uncertain, and both Americans and Chinese feel difficult to adapt to the new situation, creating a lot of anxieties, misunderstandings, and also second guessing. Chinese have difficult to adapt to its new positions, how to manage its foreign relations from the position of so-called strength. Okay, the U.S. has a problem of adapting to the rise of China and deal with China on that kind of basis. Second, of course, you have domestic politics, especially in China and the U.S. Politicians grab certain hot issues and try to play with it, especially conflicts and differences. Okay, for example, the South China Sea difference. Okay, On the U.S. side, it's made, some people made it as a sort of principle, a difference in principle of freedom of navigation. That's not true. China is a strong supporter of freedom of navigation. Why? Because China has a lot of trade, among other things. The real difference is whether a country has the right to conduct military activities, intelligence activities very close to another country's territory, okay, even in the high seas. Okay. The U.S. believes that countries have the right. China thinks that countries do not have the right. So it's a question of how to interpret international maritime law. But because of politics, it was made a big issue. And also, the third factor is so the previous two factors have led to a lot of conflicts and problems between the two countries. But then we have a third factor, that is shared stakes and interests in the old existing international order or regional order. Okay, we have a lot of economic relations. We agree that we adhere to the principle of non-proliferation. We are seeking to promote peace and stability, and also we are working together for to reverse climate change. So we have a lot of shared stakes and interests, and that, to some extent, explained why we're not that confrontational so far. So there are some factors who are driving for confrontation, whereas others are pushing for cooperation. The past few years have seen the factors driving for confrontation gaining the upper hand. Whether they will continue to shape the evolution of the regional order depends on how regional countries, especially China and the US, manage their relationship. The recent San Francisco summit between China and the US and the forthcoming China-Japan-South Korea summit offer some hope for stabilization of relations and engaging in cooperation. However, there is no good reason to be too optimistic at the moment. Ideological difference, strategic distrust, domestic politics all make stabilization of the relationship very difficult, let alone its improvement. Therefore, it will take great sustained efforts between China and the US, as well as other stakeholders in the region, to make sure that the regional order will not veer into one of confrontation. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jingo. It is always, well, in Korea also, it is always fascinating to listen to what China is thinking. And well, we will go back to a few more, well, we will go back to you with a few more questions. Okay, next, I will invite our Japanese the participant, Professor Hideaki Shiroyama from University of Tokyo. So Hide, onegaishimasu.
Thank you, Jason, for the kind introduction, and also thank you very much, President Park, for enabling this kind of a very important gathering. I would like to talk about the geopolitics and the regional governance for global public goods or global public policies. I myself is working rather than on the narrower security issue. I have been working on the interface between the science, technology, and public policy, or the governance for the global public goods, just like climate change and global public health. So what I'd like to do here is to try to connect the geopolitics and the regional polarization, what kind of the impact those kind of the situation have on the achievement and the implementation for the global public goods. And also the other way of saying is that we had a story, different narrative from the panelists here about the big structure or the strategic competition But I'd like to give a little bit a different perspective from the bottom-up perspective for what is happening at the field level. And also, I'd like to pay attention to the role of the Korea in this process. Because of the supply chain disruption during the COVID-19 and increasing geopolitical conflict between the United States and China, the trend so-called friend sharing or the relocalization of the global supply chain is attempted. And then those attempts have impact on the provision of the global public goods for issues such as global health and climate change. There are several examples we'd like to share with you. The initial attempt, for example, of the supply chain restructuring, focusing on the global health issue, in response to the so-called vaccine diplomacy by China, Quad, the collaboration between the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, picked up the global health issue as a priority item together with the cyber or the emerging technologies. Then the Quad vaccine partnership was set up in March 2021 and aimed to deliver 1 billion vaccine by the end of the 2022. India was in charge of the manufacturing. United States and Japan were expected to be in charge of the R&D and some part of the manufacturing. And Australia, for example, are expected to play a role for the delivery, for example. But the Quad vaccine partnership was not necessarily successful, as the fact shows that only 400 million the vaccine were delivered to 40% of the target. And India implemented the export restriction. They played a very important role for manufacturing of the vaccine, that's true. But partly because of the domestic surge demand, they have to stop the export. So because of that disrupt the kind of the attempt of the Quad. And the choice of the vaccine itself caused a little bit concern. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine was chosen, but there was a concern about the use of that. Because of that, partly because of that, the vaccine partnership was not necessarily successful, and now it is reframed into the so-called Quad Health Security Partnership in May 2023. Besides the attempt of a Quad, Korea is not part of the Quad, but Korea have an interesting initiative for collaborating with the WHO, World Health Organization, for setting up a so-called WHO Biomanufacturing Training Hub in February 2022 to support the regional manufacturing of the vaccine. So the collaboration is not limited to the Quad or those kind of geopolitical coalition, but the Korea try to utilize the WHO, the multilateral organization, in this context to respond to the global challenges and also to advance the biomanufacturing capability and the competitiveness of Korea. That's one case. The restructuring, the second, the supply chain has progressed concerning the semiconductors. It's true. United States strengthened the export control of the manufacturing of the equipment and the material of the semiconductors in October 2022, and Japan and the Netherlands followed later. As was already mentioned, the so-called Chip 4, the collaboration led by the United States, among the United States, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, was prepared in September 2022, and first meeting was held in February 2023. Even though the Korea was initially reluctant because of the existing collaboration with China, but finally, the Korea was also the part. That's one of the examples of the Indo-Pacific, the kind of the geopolitical collaboration. It can be said that the collaboration concerning semiconductors is substantially relatively progressed, partly because of the relative easiness of the arrangement, because the existing comparative advantage technologically and also the capability is concentrated in a relatively limited number of the advanced countries, just like Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and the US. In addition to this specific example, there is attempt of the multilateral framework for the wider issue, such as the IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for the Prosperity, which was launched in the May 2012. among the 14 partners, including Australia, India, Indonesia, Japan, ROK, New Zealand, Philippines, and Singapore, Thailand, and the United States, and Vietnam. Pillar 2 of the IPEF is about the supply chain. The ministerial meeting in May 2023, a substantial agreement concerning the international IPEF supply chain agreement was made. And in that agreement, 5 purposes were mainly identified. Established the criteria for the critical sector and goods, increasing the resiliency and investment in the critical sector and goods, the establishing and the information sharing and the crisis response mechanism, and strengthening the supply chain logistics and enhancing the role of the workers. In addition, the very detailed, relatively detailed governance mechanism was identified, including the supply chain council or supply chain crisis response network. Then in November 2023, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity Agreement was signed in San Francisco. In this framework, so the general mechanism and process for identifying and responding to the critical item in supply chain is well written in agreement, but it is not clear how much substantial interest among the member countries were made. For example, the ASEAN countries might have relatively not so much positive in the agreement. For example, Indonesia, for example. And concerning the restructuring of the supply chain of the lithium and the cobalt, for example, which is necessary for the battery, so China played a very important role. Of course, some diversion seems to be attempted, but the result is not so clear at this moment. The pillar 3 of the IPEF is about the clean economy. That the meetings in San Francisco, also the substantial agreement was made on the so-called clean economy agreement of the IPEF. So in the agreement, there are several attempts for pursuing the shared climate objective and finding the respective pathway to the net zero emission economies. The collaboration relating to the research and development, the strengthening of the interconnection among the countries in the region, and the strengthening the clean energy supply chain across the market by building the better understanding of the challenges and vulnerability of the region was attempted, and also support for the just transition was made in the framework. And in relation to that, also, there are several dialogue mechanisms were established. And one of the interesting examples relating to this supply chain strengthening is the joint initiative by Japan and Korea relating to the regional hydrogen initiative. So the hydrogen and ammonia is expected to be an important source for energy in the process of the zero emission, and Korea and Japan try to pursue that. Domestically, it's a technologically very interesting the option, but economically, the price issue is still a very important factor, and maybe potentially the joint initiative can be very interesting in this process. This kind of the initiative was mentioned in the Clean Economy Agreement discussion, and besides the meeting in San Francisco in November 2023, Japan and Korea made an announcement in the Stanford universities. Okay, so those are the example, my micro example of what is happening in the field. And maybe based on that, I'd like to make a few, identified implication of that. The first implication I'd like to draw from these experiences that there is a limits for the impact of the geopolitics or the securitization of the supply chain issue in general. As the case of the global health case or the actual implementation of the IPEF case shows, it provided a framework and they tried to set up the agenda, but implementation is not still not at that stage. But of course, second, there is a variety of the level of implementation. In the case of semiconductor, it's true that the substantial reorganization is progressed and it may have an impact on the China, at least for the short-term perspective. We are not sure about the longer-term impact, but there seems to be a variety of that. And then the third point I'd like to mention is that what's the impact of those kind of the limits of to the achievement of the global public goods, including climate change mitigation or the global health response. Of course, some of the attempts may have a potential negative impact. The vaccine regionalization is not necessarily successful relating to the Quad attempt. And also, there seems to be a challenge for the joint initiative for the hydrogen, for example, even though this might be a very interesting initiative. But thinking about the climate change and the global health issue, that does not necessarily mean a bad thing. What's the limitation of the geopolitical impact of the supply chain means is that the interdependence and the collaboration continued to the substantial extent. So, if the impact is too strong, that might have a negative impact for the pursuing of the global public goods perspective, the increasing price and so on. So it's true that the narrative and some of our policy of the supply chain security issue is important, but it seems to have an impact, the limitation. So, for example, potentially there can be argument that there is a risk trade-off between the climate risk and the supply chain risk. And I think that there is a possible argument that thinking about the supply chain risk, we should accept the climate change risk, to avoid the supply chain risk. That kind of argument can be theoretically possible, but that's not happening. When we are talking about the polycrisis, the pursuing of the decarbonization is still the very important factor. So in that respect, we have the kind of the thinking to put the supply chain issue in the more broader context. That's one thing. And also the another dimension, which I don't have a time to discuss, but but which seems to be important is the importance of the other multilateral mechanism for dealing with the climate change and global health and so on. That's the other side of the story, but that will leave for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Hide. Well, you have brought up another important dimension of soft security and multilateral cooperation in the region, as well as the bottom-up approach, and those issues are indeed receiving growing attention. So we will go back also with the question, and also in the next panel, the next session, we'll delve into those economic governance a lot more in details. But certainly, it needs to be considered together with the Korea's strategy and the Korean Peninsula issues. Okay, next, I will invite Professor Yoo Young-wook from NUS.
Okay, thank you. I want to start by thanking Korea University and Che Institute for their kind invitation for me to serve on this panel. It's always a challenge to be the last speaker on such distinguished panel, but I will try my best to add something interesting. I'm going to cluster my remarks. So the first set of remarks will be about the US-China relationship and how I see it, and then the second set will be about its implications for the Korean Peninsula. Okay, so let's start with this graph. So I think anyone who has studied modern Japanese foreign policy or East Asian affairs, they will automatically see, right, a lot of similarities between what's happening between US and China and what actually happened between US and Japan in the 1980s and 1990s. So here the yellow orange line shows the aggregate GDP of Japan, which was on course to surpass that of the USA throughout the 1980s and 1990s. And as everybody knows, in 1985, the US government came in, forced the Plaza Accord on Japan. 1986, first semiconductor agreement, US government forced it on Japan. It thought it was not enough, and then in 1991, forced second semiconductor agreement on Japan. I actually call those agreements unequal treaties, right? I mean, this is how historians would describe it. And then you look at the green line, which is the aggregate GDP growth of China, which is on trajectory to take over the USA. So if you look at the way the Trump administration approached, in its China policy, it was same approach, right? So it was trying to impose a set of unequal agreements on Beijing, force those agreements, right, for China to sign, which would relegate China's economic growth, certainly, right, at a level that is not enough to surpass that of the USA. Now, unlike Japan, which was completely dependent on the USA for its national security, that's why the Japanese government had no choice but to sign those unequal treaties or agreements. China does not depend on the USA for national security, has different political regime type, different political ambitions, and there's the individual factor, Xi Jinping, right, with his pride in Chinese culture, Chinese system, and so on and so forth, right? There was no way he was going to sign, right, whatever the USA was offering to Beijing. And then on to Biden administration, right? The USA realized that, yes, its approach to China, right, trying to force unequal agreement on Beijing was not working. That's when the US-China relationship changed to strategic competition. And here, all of you know, we've had at least one historical, right, episode of this strategic competition that's between US and USSR. And this is the competition not only for capabilities, but also for efficiency and the resilience of the system that that you have. So I don't have the figure here, but the Soviet economic size at its peak was about 60% of the US GDP. But at the same time, the Soviet was investing as much as the USA. The Soviet Union was spending as much on military expenditures as the USA. Now, of course, if efficiency is not there, this creates a lot of pressure on your system. And as you all know, history has it, the Soviet system internally collapsed because it could not sustain this competition with the USA. I think this is what's going on between US and China. I know that academics sometimes debate whether it's the security dilemma or power transition that describes the best the US-China relationship. In my view, what's going on between these two great powers is power transition dynamics with all the social psychological factors that give rise to the security dilemma. And the US-China relationship has fundamentally changed from symbiotic positive relationship that both countries benefited to a confrontational and negative sum game. So here, the main purpose of this game is I don't care whether I generate cost, right? Self-inflicted harm, so long as I can hurt you more, that's winning to me. So, as Shiroyama Sensei talked about, at the heart of this is supply chains, right? So, for example, the U.S. pressure on China in the semiconductors. Yes, sure, U.S. firms will be hurt, but U.S. government, the purpose is I can hurt you even more. And if I were the advisor to the U.S. government, yes, go ahead, right? This is the right kind of policy, right, to win this competition. And we know that the Chinese government is throwing a lot of money in the semiconductor industry in order to remain competitive, right, in this sector. And if China cannot compete in the semiconductor sector, forget about all the advanced technologies, then this hegemonic competition is over. Now, of course, amidst the growing US-China strategic competition, I think the strategic importance of the Korean Peninsula has increased, as Professor Kim mentioned, as both great powers now see greater utility of the two Koreas for their political purpose in this great power competition. So the US invitation to South Korea to join the CHIP 4, right, the South Korea getting invited to G7 and so on and so forth is part of the US strategy to make sure that South Korea plays a greater role for US political purpose vis-a-vis China. Xi Jinping is a busy person, but if you remember, between early 2018 and mid-2019, when there was a deep flurry of diplomatic activities initiated by the Trump administration to entice North Korea close to the USA, Xi Jinping basically gave a free pass to Kim Jong-un. Come and show up, I will just meet you anytime, right? So Kim Jong-un met with Xi Jinping in that space at least 3 times, right? And then they took this nice romantic walk at some beach, right? Talking privately between 2 of them. This is also Chinese concern and interest to make sure that North Korea does not move away from China. So 2 Koreas are getting more attention from the great powers because of the US-China strategic competition. I think the Korean Peninsula is strategically important in another fundamental sense. If you look at various regional flashpoints, whether it be South China Sea, Taiwan, or East China Sea, if there takes a military conflict in these areas, China has to get directly involved. There's no other way. China cannot send a proxy to fight on its behalf. South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan, it has to get directly involved. The only regional flashpoint where there could be a proxy war taking place is the Korean Peninsula. And we know that North Korea has a significant nuclear capabilities, and all the Koreans remember whenever there was a great power rivalry, there was always military conflict on the Korean Peninsula. When Japan challenged China for regional hegemony, that military conflict was fought on the Korean Peninsula. When Japan challenged the first Eurasian power, Russia, that conflict was fought on the Korean Peninsula. When the US and USSR were competing for global hegemony, that proxy war was fought on the Korean Peninsula. And now we have intensifying US-China strategic competition. No wonder Koreans get worried about potential military conflict on the Korean Peninsula. No wonder they are thinking nuclear option as a way to maintain peace and stability on the peninsula. So I think it creates more incentive and opportunity for the great powers to increase their influence over the 2 Koreas, which can pit the 2 Koreas against each other. But this kind of dynamic is not unique only in the Korean Peninsula. We see this dynamic happening in Southeast Asia, in other parts of the world. Great powers are trying to entice important actors to their side so that they can generate greater cost on the other. In addition, I think North Korea could also seek to utilize the growing complexity of this regional strategic environment to its advantage. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with this figure, the same family, right? Too many Kims. But let's just go Kim 1, Kim 2, Kim 3. So under Kim 3, the total number of nuclear and missile tests conducted was higher than the combined number of nuclear and missile tests under Kim 1 and Kim 2. So, who knows? Maybe there's domestic politics, political reasons behind this. I'm sure that this could be an opportunistic behavior on the part of North Korea, known as brinkmanship diplomacy. Pay attention to us, come and talk to us. I need to extract concessions in nuclear, denuclearization negotiations. Or it could be North Korea's way of perfecting its nuclear capabilities. I actually think it's all of these 3. That's behind Kim 3's interest in testing nuclear weapons and missiles. So, as great power competition increases, it's not only the great powers that seek to utilize these 2 Koreas for their purpose. North Korea seek to utilize this intensifying great power competition to its own advantage. And hence what happens in other parts of the region and the world, for instance in the Taiwan Strait, is likely to have negative implications and destabilize the Korean Peninsula. And I think the current Yoon government is keenly aware of this reality. So they want to make sure that other parts of the world, South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, peace is maintained so that the Korean Peninsula would not be negatively affected by what happens or what might happen in other parts of the region. I think South Korean government and its policy priority should be maintenance of peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. But the real question here is how to do this, right? I mean, both the progressives and conservatives in Korea, they all agree peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula should be the utmost priority for their administration, but they differ greatly on the how question. My view is why the goal of denuclearization should be maintained as a long-term goal. There's no way, I mean, seriously, there's no way North Korea would give up, right, its nuclear weapons voluntarily. Right? And all the South Korean foreign policy objectives towards North Korea for the last 30 plus years, whether it be denuclearization or unification, dramatically failed. I think it's time for us to be a bit more realistic. Then what we should, in the immediate term, what we should aim to do is to establish certain set of conditions whereby regional countries can exist in a relative peaceful manner with a nuclear North Korea. Now, this is not giving up on the goal of denuclearization, but in the immediate time period, peaceful coexistence with a nuclear North Korea should be a policy priority. And here, I mean, I'm not a policymaker. I'm just a pure academic. There is one political debate that I just find a little difficult to understand in South Korea. So, conservatives always promote deterrence, hardline approach to North Korea. Progressives always want to promote engagement. But there's nothing in their political ideology that prevents conservatives to adopting an engagement policy towards North Korea. I think it's time for the conservatives in South Korea to show how to engage with North Korea in the right manner. So therefore, take that engagement policy from the progressives, right, and offer the right kind of engagement with North Korea, so that in the future, if there's a change in Korean government, the progressives can also learn from the conservatives. Thank you so much.
Professor Sung-Han Kim just mentioned me. Look at 2022, and you are seeing the uncomparable was this huge number, and actually he was leading the National Security Council at that time. So and he said, you see, it was what happened to me every week. Actually, we had all the North Korean missile tests almost every week, and NSC meetings had to be convened. So we can see last 1 year, 2 years, yeah. Well, we are still in a major crisis period, but things have got worse significantly. Thank you very much, Professor Ryu. Okay, we had started a little bit late, but actually we are quite behind the schedule. So I think I may have to speed up quite a bit. So why don't I make a very quick question to the panelists, and then I will open the floor. But actually, while answering this question, well, you can briefly answer, but you can also raise question to other panelists. I will just combine the round one in a quicker way, and quickly move to the round two, the Q&A from the floor. Professor Kim, you have mentioned your 3 point on the challenges and opportunities. It was clearly well summarized, and what Korea is the policy the foreign policy guideline of South Korea is the global people state. The Korea is pursuing playing more role and showing inclusiveness. At the same time, enhancing the alliance, the ties. We will move into the third year of administration. And maybe last year we have achieved the Korea, Japan, U.S. trilateral, the partnership, and many other bilateral and multilateral meetings. Okay, so next year, Korea may have to get engaged more with other countries. other countries in the Indo-Pacific, and including China and Southeast Asia. What would be not just slogan? What would be the actual pulling force? What would be the incentive? What would be the pulling force to bring those countries more closer to the orbit of Korean pivotal state strategy? And to John, well, just I will send out the card, and you may respond briefly. John, thank you very much for your point on the multilateral and liberal international order. Yes, indeed, Korea need to get engaged. Well, Korea need a new engagement, the strategy, and there are many old multilateral institutions, many newly arising institutions. Well, there is G7 and IPEF, in the Pacific Economic Forum, etc. If you can just pinpoint one or two specific international, say, a regime or multilateral scheme, Korea should focus more on in forthcoming years. We cannot deal with everything at the same time, but certainly we may need some highlighted, to prioritize the point. To Professor John, well, your point was well taken, but I'm curious. Well, in Korea, there is a huge curiosity on China's view on Korea, Japan, U.S. trilateral partnership. Is it really hurting the Korea-China relation? In a recent poll among the experts, a lot of Korean experts responded that this trilateral partnership it would not and should not hurt the Korea-China relation. So what is China's view on this trilateral partnership? Okay, and for Hide, yes, your point on global public goods and a lot of the soft security agenda is perfectly relevant. Then the Korea and Japan should also should sit tightly and should cooperate a lot more on those issues. But what is your reading of Japan's the willingness and incentive from the Japanese side? It was Korea. Yes, Korea should do its job, but also what is your reading on the Japanese, the politics, the bureaucracies, and the business as well? So in pursuing this kind of the soft security agenda, the green supply chain issues. So I want to hear more about the Japanese perspective. And lastly, Professor Liu, you mentioned the dilemma. Is this kind of the dilemma of inter-Korean relations? I recall in 2009 when 5 University meeting was first held in Princeton. During the luncheon speech, at the time, Professor Han Sung-ju, left one remark, and I still remember that vividly. He mentioned North Korea during past many decades. North Korea has been standing on the wrong side of history, but North Korea has stood on the right side of historical luck. So North Korea has been pursuing nuclear programs and has been under the sanctions, and so a lot of experts expected that the region may not survive or economic difficulties, but North Korea has survived, and many times it was pretty lucky. Okay, and Professor Liu. So yes, certainly Korea, and especially Korean conservative need more the engagement strategy. But if the Korean conservative would go for that kind of engagement strategy, what would be the first sentence? What would be the first wording the Korean conservative can deliver to the North Korean side? So not just let's sit together or any kind of the more kind of tangible kind of the first step, well, which will be useful to reopen the dialogue. So what was the golden key, if you can find any? So that would be my the question, and well, I hope panelists will briefly answer those questions, and then we will move to the Q&A from the.
Before I answer to your question, let me briefly comment on your last point about the survival of North Korea. North Korea has survived many difficulties, but I need to correct that remark by saying that North Korean regime has survived, right? But North Korean people has been suffering, and they have been approaching the borderline of survival and death. And there's a rumor that the great leader Kim Jong-un cannot go to sleep without sleeping pills. So probably he has to be, if it is true, he has to be concerned about his own survival. And, you know, with your respect to your question, I think the year of 2024 is going to be the year of, I would say, CJKI, China, Japan, Korea, plus India. Because this year we have set the stepping stone for AJK, America, Japan, and Korea, trilateral relationship. It was really a historic moment for three of us. Next year, we have to engage China through the platform of CJK Trilateral Summit, hopefully taking place early next year. And also, India is critically important for Korea. As you may agree, India is the only country in the world who is being quoted by almost every major power in the world. From the technological point of view and the economic point of view, and also strategic point of view, India is being seen as a critical partner for Korea. So next year is going to be the year of CJKI. Yeah.
Thank you very much. John?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I thought that when you asked it, I thought of, was it President Lee who had put forward the idea of global Korea, and in many ways my answer is more of global Korea, which is to say there's what I was trying to argue earlier, that there's a lot of upside potential for South Korea to exercise agency, middle power leadership. If we're moving into a world where coalitions, alignments, partnerships, groupings are the coin of the realm, are what matter. And the two superpowers need coalition partners, and that makes them open, somewhat vulnerable to other parties, swing states. It's why India is being courted, as was just suggested by Sunhan. I think there's a real opportunity to work that system, as I said, as a country that can cut across these divides, north and south and east and west. I think playing a role, increasingly role in what would be a kind of next generation G7 that would include South Korea and Australia. I think, secondly, reviving the Obama era informal grouping, the so-called Nuclear Security or Safety Summit, which was one of the great innovations that Obama and company had put forward. And recall that Seoul was the second host for that multi-iterative summit. It was informal. It was kind of world leaders sitting around educating each other on not just nuclear weapons, but the security associated with nuclear materials. And so South Korea would be a kind of moral site because of the North Korean threat to be a key party in the revival of that. I think working thirdly with the G7 parties that made this decision in Hiroshima to expand support for global South development to kind of catch up with China, and working through the World Bank, which has shifted away from infrastructure development to other kinds of developmental assistance, but to go back to that area where a lot of the global South really needs assistance, which is in infrastructure, and to play that catalytic role also with the Asian Investment Bank. And then finally, do more in building out this new, what we hope is a special relationship between Japan and Korea. That this has always been a kind of weak link in the region and globally. And there's so much possibility there for economic, technological, and security cooperation that could stabilize the world. One theme, kind of meta theme that is behind all of these suggestions is that we are moving away from a kind of hierarchical world, a hegemonic world where the decisions come from the top and kind of move down or percolate down to other countries, but it's really the other way around. A lot of the energy is percolating up, and it's no longer a so-called hub and spoke system in East Asia. It's more of a lattice work architecture with a Quad as a part of that. And by the way, Korea should, in its interest in India, might manifest some of that interest through the Quad. So there's room for more participation there. So that kind of working the system, we're at a very creative moment, and Korea has a really unique voice to make ground on this kind of next generation institution building.
Okay, thank you, John. Jingguo.
Thank you. Well, Chinese have many views. And first of all, I want to say that personally, I think it's a great historical step for South Korea and Japan to reconcile with each other. I think probably it's the right thing to do. It's time to live in the present and for the future, not stranded in the past. Second, I think Chinese government has no problem with enhancing cooperation between US, Japan, and South Korea, as long as it's not targeted against China. Okay? But the problem is Chinese government get the impression that such kind of efforts, part of such kind of efforts, at least, are directed against China. Talking about Taiwan, South China Sea. I think if it's targeted against China, of course, China has to oppose to it. Okay? So there should be more dialogue and consultation between the three countries and China if they want to clarify their views and minimize the chance for confrontation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jingguo. Hide?
Yeah, thank you. And Japanese incentive to collaborate with Korea, and in some sector there is clearly true that there is a clear incentive for that. I mentioned about hydrogen joint initiative. For example, for that kind of thing, the clear incentive can be identified. 50 years ago, when there was the previous oil crisis, Japan individually invested in the natural gas, LNG infrastructure and shipping and so on. That was possible, but not now it's anymore possible. So we need to, Japan need to have a collaboration with the relevant partners, so Korea seems to be a very appropriate one. But on the other hand, in general, there seems to be still a kind of the perception gap in the field of the science and technology innovation policy. For example, when we see the kind of the policy document relating to the revitalization of the Japanese science and technology innovation power, still, we just see the table comparing the Japan and the European and American and so on, missing Korea, for example, in the table. So, in the mindset of those kind of policymakers still, the broader picture does not exist. So realistic international landscape need to be embedded in the mindset of the broader sectoral policy issue, including the science, technology, innovation policy. That's my sense. Just in addition to that, relating to the John's point about the common languages issue with the global south, I think that the global health issue and the climate change is a very important element of that. For example, the global health was used as a major item in the Hiroshima process, and the reason why it was put on that process is that, of course, the substance is important, but more than that, when I talked to the Sherpa of the G7 meeting, and what he said was that this is a very important bridging to the global south. So putting that is an important element in the G7 process. And concerning substance, actually, the agreement of the pandemic fund and so on was made in the G20s. So using the global health as a stepping stone, the G7 and the G20 are connected, and then global health. So this seems to be one of the very interesting practical mechanisms can be observed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Young-wook?
All right. Being a carefree academic, I'm not the right person to draft anything. But I think the first sentence should try to change Kim Jong-un's perspective on his own legacy. So this guy wants to achieve or claim achievements that are on par with his father and his grandfather, and that's why he wants to generate economic growth for North Korea. I think one thing that we can try to do is to change his perspective that he can be even greater than that. He can be a key person in history who shapes Korean Peninsular order, right, out of his own initiative. I think that sentence will be good. And then the engagement policy that I've talked about that conservatives could adopt, Professor Kim mentioned a pertinent point. So the engagement policy from the progressives aimed to sustain the North Korean regime. And I think that's just not the right kind of purpose to have. I think conservatives, when they engage with North Korea, the aim should be to nudge the North Korean regime, no matter how small step it may be, towards reform and opening. Right? So with that purpose, I think whatever engagement policy that we can have with North Korea, that should be the right purpose. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Young-wook. So, well, we had such a great discussion, but time was truly limited. So, well, at least I will promise that this 5 university conference will work hard on to make the next season. And the next season, we will try to find much better answer for this complicated question. So, upon that note, please join me thanking the great panelists for sharing their insight. Thank you very much. Now I will wrap up the public session. Thank you very much.